This is Real Talk, the Customer Insights Show with Jenn Vogel, a top-rated live stream and podcast in the market research and insights industry. We're live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Join Jenn and her guests for this live discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Also available on podcast channels. This live stream is presented to you by Vox Pop Me, the leader in video research and ranked #1 in qualitative research by Grit 2 years running. Here's today's live conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, and everyone who wants to understand their customers better. I'm Jenn Vogel. Just a quick reminder that Real Talk is a finalist for the Market Research Podcast of the Year. I think this is your last chance to vote. The winner is determined by your vote, so please click the link in the notes and remember to cast yours today. And thank you for listening and for all the guests who have joined us so far this year. So let's get going with today's episode. Today, I want to talk about Gen Z. That's the age group born between 1998 and 2016. Certainly an age important to many brands. But what are we missing about this generation? So to find out, I'm joined by Hana Ben-Shabat, author of the #1 new release in demography, Gen Z 360, Preparing for the Inevitable Change in Culture, Work, and Commerce. Welcome, Hana.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining today. I'm so excited to have this chat with you.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about the book. Tell us about your journey to write the book and, what prompted it and what you were trying to learn and to share.
Sure. So, it's all started after spending a lot of time with clients as a management consultant. And throughout the years, I noticed how much my clients struggle to understand millennials. And even in 2018, when millennials were 38 years old, I still encounter clients who are saying, we need to understand millennials better. We need to approach them differently. We need to think about what we do with them in the workplace. And I realized, this has been going on for like 20 years and we are still struggling. So there must be an opportunity to do something very different with Generation Z. And I believe that we have a great opportunity right now to get things right from the start at the early phase and not to repeat all the mistakes that we did with millennials, mistakes that actually were pretty costly because there were many missed opportunities, there were many wasted resources, strategies have to be defined and redefined, and it caused a lot of frustrations, both for millennials employees and for millennials consumers, not to mention as marketeers and management teams that keep on going through iteration after iterations of addressing this generation.
It's so interesting. Why do you think it was so difficult to understand millennials? Do you think is it something uniquely millennial that people and companies weren't understanding, or just more like you were saying, like people were behind and not quite getting it, or why do you think it's 20 years of we need to better understand millennials?
I think it was because millennials, when they arrived, they presented a real shift in thinking and aspirations to the previous generations. So, for example, in the workplace, they didn't fit the mold of what it is to be a good employee. They showed up and they started talking about work-life balance, something that was for baby boomers completely foreign. And there was just that misunderstanding of who they are and what they really want. So I think that, that kind of shift created a lot of confusions because they simply did not fit what the previous generation expected from them. And that just caused that cycle of, let's try and do things differently, but, keep on trying and repeating and experimenting and frankly failing in many cases until things got on the right track with that generation. And I think we are in a very high risk to repeat those mistakes with Gen Z if we don't take a different approach.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what do you think, like, how is Gen Z different from their previous generations, and maybe what's similar about them with millennials or others?
So I think maybe let's step a little bit backward here and just remind ourselves. I think people tend to think about generations as this is a group of people who were born between year X and year Y, which is true. But really what defines a generation is the cultural, social, and political context in which they grew up, which is the right way to look at generation, because that context has significant influence on the values and beliefs and therefore the behaviors of these generations. I think in the past, it was very easy to define a generation by a few landmark events. So if you take the baby boomers, they were defined by the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement. The Gen Xer were defined by the fall of the Berlin Wall and what is actually presented globally, and the stock market crash of 1987 and the AIDS epidemic. Millennials were growing up in the shadows of September 11 and everything that came after. But when we think about Gen Z, it's really a very different story. If you think about what happened since 1998, which is the year that the first Gen Z was born, they have witnessed so many events that you would consider landmark events. So it's the 2008 recession, is the election of Barack Obama as the first African-American president, the gun violence, especially the two major events at Sandy Hook and Parkland, Florida, the election of Donald Trump, Black Lives Matters, the Me Too movements. So and obviously most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, this is enough to feel a lifetime. And I think this is one thing that makes this generation different. They just grew up in a period of a constant change. And that has a huge effect on their psyche and on their values, and then of course on their behaviors. But then that brings the question, how do you actually react to these circumstances in which you grew up? And this is where I see a huge difference between millennials and Gen Z. Millennials, in response to their life experiences, especially the economic context of high student loan debt and long periods of soft job markets, they became very risk averse. They questioned the need to own a home. They delayed marriage and having kids. And even the way they think about savings, there is a recent report by BlackRock that says that millennials keep 65% of their savings in cash compared to the national average of 58%, because they are afraid of catastrophic market event. Gen Z, on the other hand, this extreme list of events and experiences that they had and that constant change, they actually showing a very different attitudes. They're take calculated risks. So for one thing, they're really determined to learn from the mistake of their predecessor, because they really look at the millennials and they say, we don't want to be like them. They view home ownership very favorably. They have interest and they are active in investing more than generations before them. And some of them even started saving for retirements, which is astonishing when you think about how young they are. So I think that's in a very broad brush, risk aversion versus risk taking is a very important difference between these two generations that manifests itself in a lot of places, from the workplace to the consumer markets, etc.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So I guess what's interesting, and I don't know, you probably know the dates more certainly better than I do off the top of my head, but it seems like the millennial generation spans more time, but that shorter time period for Gen Z, like it is packed with so much more kind of cultural and social impact that, like when you were kind of going through the list and saying like these are like landmark events that could happen throughout an entire lifetime within a span of 18 years or whatever it is. That's pretty astonishing.
Yeah, and when we talk about landmark event, we are talking about landmark event that happen during your formative years.
Sure.
Because during the formative years are the year that shapes your view of the world and then affects you for the rest of your life. Because obviously all the list of things that I mentioned, millennials experience them too, but they were already adults when those happen. So I think that's the difference, is when those landmark event takes place. Are they happening in those formative years that are going to influence you for the rest of your life?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think what's interesting is I hear, I don't know if we just haven't yet admitted that there is another generation after millennials that are now starting to become adults, actually. But I do hear people who technically kind of fall in that Gen Z bucket described as millennials oftentimes, like, oh, they're that's a millennial thing or whatever. I'm like, actually, that person's not even a millennial, they're actually an adult who is in a new generation. So
Yeah.
it does feel like we're kind of at the forefront of starting to talk about this generation as like decision makers and people who are actually purchasing and making decisions. Like you said, buying a home, to think that somebody that was born in 1996 is old enough to buy a home is like a little scary for me. But yeah, I guess that brings me into like who is the Gen Z consumer? Like those make purchase decisions.
Yeah.
How would you describe them as consumers?
Yes, I think one thing I would like to note about the Gen Z consumers is that this is another thing that makes them super different, is Gen Z consumers did not wait to be 18 or 20 to actually feel empowered to consume. This is a generation that grew up with technology, and I'm going to touch about it a little bit more later. And they started making purchasing decisions already at a very young age, downloading apps, downloading games, paying for small purchases on the internet, and so on and so forth. So they are already from a very young age making purchasing decisions, which means comparing between products and understanding trade-offs and making the final decision and having to live with the consequences of their decisions. But going back to your questions about who is the Gen Z consumers, I think one thing we have to remember is that this generation consumption behavior is a direct result of their upbringing and the cultural context in which they grow up. So first and foremost, this is the most diverse generation to live in this country. 48% are minorities. And this is not a simple demographic statistics. This is something that had a huge influence on how they view the world and also what they expect from companies and from brands. So that's really an integral part of who they are. The second thing is growing up during the 2008 recession, and to remind the audience, Gen Z the older one were about 10 years old at the time. And they had to basically experience the economic stress that come with that. They've seen their parents either losing home or losing a job, or even just having the anxiety that this may happen to them. And that's something that they internalized and translate into values and actions, which is, how do I secure my financial future? And how do I make sure that I am not ending up in that scary place? And add to that the recent experience of the economic effect of COVID-19. This basically make them very conservative financially, and very cautious when it comes to money and spending. The third fact is really about them being the true digital natives. This is a generation that doesn't know a world without a mobile phone or a search engine, or social media for that matter. 87% of Gen Z had access to a cell phone by the time they were 15. And they do, how they communicate, how they think, how they learn, how they process information, and obviously how they shop. And so that's kind of one side of things. But technology not only is a tool to access things, it's obviously a tool to receive. And that tool actually created an exposure to what's happening in the world around them in a way that we have never seen before. And as a result, Gen Z at a very early age started to question things and also feel inclined to take actions, which is what make them more activist than generations before them. And I believe that because they know how to use technology in their favor, they know how to use technology from simple things like finding a product online to creating a movement and mobilizing people for a cause. I think that knowledge plus their values is what's going to make them potentially the most disruptive consumers that we have seen before.
Wow, that is that's a pretty big prediction there. But I can see where that's coming from, with especially when you say like the true digital natives, they don't know a life without mobile devices and without, social media. That is just it's so foreign. So I'm curious, like, how, I guess the millennial kind of caution around spending is a little different from the Gen Z caution around spending, right? Like, maybe is that because the experience is more, I guess around, you had mentioned like paying back student loans and, that kind of difficulty financially when millennials were kind of on the older side, whereas Gen Z were children during that time and experiencing it from a different lens. Like, I guess, how does that caution around finances and spending, lead to such different behavior?
Yes, and I think one way to think about this is millennials are cautious about spending, and they take that risk-averse approach, which means I'm not going to spend, I'm not going to buy a home, I am going to avoid certain things. It's more kind of like avoidance. I think Gen Z basically saying, okay, I am going to be cautious about spending, which means I'm going to save more, I'm going to prioritize, I'm going to put my money into things that are going to secure my financial future. So it's a very different kind of behaviors. It's coming from the same place. I have to be cautious, but on one hand there is more kind of avoidance attitude, while on the other hand there is more action oriented attitude. Sure. And I think it's also they just very pragmatic. So they know how much money they have. They want to live within the limits that they have, and they set themselves goals and they go and achieve them.
Yeah, that makes sense. As opposed to avoiding spending entirely. Like, I'm just going to be smart about what I'm spending and be intentional. And like you said, prioritize.
Exactly.
So why do you think companies are challenged to understand Gen Z right now?
And I think really one of the reasons for that is because Gen Z represent, in terms of what Gen Z want and their characteristics, sometimes things that they do or say seem to many marketeers as being contradicting, which is not always the case. And I think it's very important to really understand the main characteristics and what is really important to them in order to start engaging with them. So in my book, I identified 4 main attributes of the Gen Z consumers. Some of these attributes, again, may seem contradicting on the surface, but really, I think one of the reasons why it is so challenging to companies is because these attributes sometimes require dramatic shifts from the way we traditionally were doing business. So let's go through these attributes. The first one is authenticity. And I think authenticity is a word that gets thrown a lot when people talk about Gen Z, to the point that it became so meaningless in a way. And I think it's important to understand that this is a very important concept for Generation Z. They are preoccupied with being authentic, and they really believe that you have to be true to yourself. And like with their attitude towards money, I think the authenticity is in a way a reaction to the world around them. This is a generation that grew up in a world surrounded by social media and celebrities, and they basically grew up to reject the overly polished and the overly idealized images that pervade our society. So when I talk to Gen Z, I hear statements like, when I look at social media, everyone is so beautiful and everyone is so successful, and it actually makes me depressed because I don't think that it's true, and it makes me feel sometimes inadequate. And as a result, they decided to adopt a more realistic view of the world and who they are, and they really live by this, what I call the Gen Z mantra, is be yourself.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you look at TikTok, which is the Gen Z playground, you will see that views of videos with the hashtag be yourself exceeded 1 billion last time I checked. And I think being authentic for them means being true and therefore trustworthy. So if you are true to yourself and you present who you are, it means that I can trust you. Mm-hmm. And I think they bring the same expectations for brands. So they want brands to be authentic, be who they are, and when they say something, back it up so I can actually trust you. So brand authenticity is extremely important when we think about building trust with this generation. The second aspect is individuality, which again, this is a generation that wants to stand out, not fit in. And I think it's important to understand that this is also a reaction. Think about it. We are living in a very competitive society. And not only you have to succeed in school, you have to be the best in everything you are to kind of get ahead, but you are living in a world of social media where there are so many things going on, and you want to stand out in some way. So they, to some extent, they see themselves as brands, which kind of bring another question to brands, like, are brands now marketing to people or marketing to mini brands, which require a completely different thinking in terms of how we actually do marketing. So on one hand, they have that kind of natural tendency to ask questions, to challenge what we do, and we see that coming through also in their consumption behaviors.
This is also interesting to me, and I want to let you do all the talking because I want to hear everything that you have to say. But this is like, first of all, I'm so impressed by the Gen Z generation. Like, I guess I don't really know much about them until hearing from you, and like all the things you were saying about, like, oh, we look at social media, everything's so polished and so perfect, it makes us feel depressed. So we don't want that. We're gonna, adopt a more real version. I feel like that's been around for ages and ages, but other generations, we just handle it so differently. It just makes us so much more fearful to be ourselves. It feels like this generation just is kind of brimming with confidence, which is really impressive to me. And what you said about our brands now marketing to mini brands, because people are really establishing their own sort of personal brands. I mean, as a B2B marketer, we're always trying to think of, businesses as, people. They're just people. So there's no difference between B2B and B2C. This is like sort of the flip side of that, right?
That's right.
Like, think of like all the B2C marketers now need to start figuring out B2B because everybody is just their own individual brand. I love that.
That's right. So, but I think one thing to make, to do justice to Gen Z, I think there is sometimes a misconception that this is, yes, they are individualistic and it's all about me, but it's not. Because for Gen Z, the we is as important as the me, because they believe that if everyone is individualistic and everyone should be celebrated, then we should recognize the we. And that brings me to the early comments that I made about diversity. This is a generation that expect from brands to demonstrate that they understand who they're talking to. And they reflect the true diversity of this generation in everything they do, in communication, in advertising. And it's diversity that goes beyond simply racial diversity. It's racial, it's gender, it's a sexual orientation, it's gender expression, it's body sizes, body shapes. And, we see some brands reacting to that, to the point that we are seeing more and more brands using real people in advertising, which I think this is where it's going from a diverse perspective. But this is really what Gen Z is looking for. So that brings me to the third attribute, which I touched upon a little bit before. This is a generation that really care about value and care about values. So it's not one or the other. And they are extremely cost conscious, and therefore delivering products at affordable prices and providing good value for money is key to attract this consumer. And but really, it's not only about the value. I think Gen Z is willing to pay and support brands that aligned with their values, brands that are doing good in the world. And I would say in the past year or so, we have seen Gen Z increasing their expectations. So it's not only that you have to do good in the world and show something for it and prove that you do it, but also expectation that you take a stance on issues that matter to them. We saw it last year with the Black Lives Matters. Gen Z very much expect brands to say, okay, what is your position? What do you do for the greater good on this issue? And some of the issues I think brands feel comfortable to engage. And in some places where issues tend to be a little bit more political, if you like, I think brands are hesitating, because traditionally brands just wanted to be everything for everybody and not upset any part of their consumer base. But I think slowly we are reaching an era that it's going to be very difficult not to take a stance on issues that matter. And I think that's going to be challenging for many marketeers who want to stay away from that sphere. So I don't think there is a single answer. I think it depends on each brand to make their decision. But I think this is something that Gen Z will continue to demand, and I think brands in the coming years will struggle to respond to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of brands are really struggling, and some clearly are doing it very well and have always been. I think the brands that do it really well kind of have always done it really well. The Ben and Jerry's, the Toms,
the Nikes.
Exactly. They've taken a social stance from the beginning. So it's the brands that are trying to make a change now where that are struggling. But But
Yeah, and I would say that if you want to take a stance now, that's fine. But if you take a stance for the sake of taking stance, Gen Z is going to see through it, and it's not going to help you. In fact, it could backfire. So unless you do something that is completely aligned with your brand spirits, that it's completely in line with your brand values, that is authentic and believable, it's better not to do it.
100%. And we did an episode a few months ago with Gilad Barash from Distillery, who about social activism for brands. And he gave some great tips on, how to get started if it hasn't really been part of your brand story, and how to be authentic and not just performative, which is really important. So that's attribute 3, value and values. What's the 4th attribute?
So the 4th one is really what I call navigating seamlessly between offline and online. And I think this is another reason why sometimes marketeers struggle with Gen Z, is because when I say we, I said, the older millennials and Gen X like me, we think of the world the way we knew it before. We lived in a physical world, and then came the internet, and now we had online. So we keep on making that separation. There is online and there is offline. For Gen Z, this separation just does not exist. For them, there is one retail and one brand, and they access that brand through all the different touch points. And more important, they have expectations that in all these touch points, you're going to be serving them in the same level of quality, and it's going to be interesting. It's going to be great service. It's going to be, it's going to be what you do in one channel equates to what you do in your other channels. And I think this is very challenging, because especially if you have physical stores, they have high expectations for experiences that are unique, that are memorable, that are, that they can share with their friends on social media. And on the other hand, when they are online, they have, an appetite for content that you have to satisfy every day and every hour. So that puts a lot of strains on brands. How do I create all that content? And I think, it's basically, you have to win equally in all these channels. And I think now that we are going back to stores and in a post-pandemic, what do you do in the stores is going to be so important, because frankly, if it's more fun to scroll through an Instagram feed, why would anyone go to a store? Okay. So I think you have to make sure that your store can deliver that level of discovery, excitement that you get when you are on social media, the level of personalization that you get when you are online in a physical environment. And I think that's, easier said than done.
Yeah. Do you think that Gen Z, when it comes to shopping in store versus online, do you think that they're a little bit more patient than other generations with online shopping, let's say? Because I'll just speak for myself personally. The reason why I shop online is because it's easier, and, I don't want to have to go to the store. I go to the store for instant gratification, and when I don't want to wait for something to be delivered. So if, Gen Z is really sort of demanding this, more of an experience in store, are they just totally comfortable waiting the 24 hours for Prime or the 2 to 3 days for expedited shipping other places? Because
and I think you're right. I think there one thing that became very clear in my research is that Gen Z, in a pre-pandemic world, I'm not talking, obviously the pandemic changed has a pickup on the online side, but in the pre-pandemic world, Gen Z would basically tell you that they go online for convenience and speed. Mm-hmm. and prices, because they can find the best prices. They go to the store for the service and for the experience. They are young. They're still young, and going to stores is something. It's a social event. You go with your friends, you go with your siblings, and you experience store in a different way. Saying that, they are not, when they talk about stores, they don't expect those, stores the way we define them, they want to have more that kind of integrated experience, that you bring some of your online into the stores and able to provide the experience that they are looking for. So it's more about the fun and what's happened in the store, as opposed to I'm going to go to the store now because that's I'm going to get things quicker.
Right. That makes a ton of sense. So what should brands, how can brands understand their Gen Z customers better? I mean, what are maybe some of the different methods for capturing their feedback directly that you would recommend?
So, we spoke about it before, and I think it's very interesting that a lot of people are saying, Gen Z is not, will never answer surveys or, not participate in focus group. I don't think this is true. I think that all the research methods that we are familiar with are very valid. I think the question is more how you actually execute them. And my recommendation is the more you make your research to resemble what they are doing in their daily life, which means social media and online, then you will be able to get their participation, and not only to get good level of responses, because you're really able to engage them. So what do I mean by that? Surveys that are designed in short bursts, that they don't have to answer 30 minutes or 60 minutes of a survey. That's really not going to happen with the Gen Z with the short attention span. I think the way you ask the question, the way you want to collect the answers, Gen Z like to share. They are a generation of creators. So asking them to answer a question with a picture or with a video could actually give you a great level of insight. To give you an example, a year ago, I asked a group of Gen Z girls and young women, what beauty means to you? And I wanted the answer in a photograph. And it was incredible to see the results and what I actually got out of that. So if they say one picture worth 1,000 words, then 1,000 picture is a gold mine for insight. So that's other thing. If you want open-ended questions, many companies today using chatbots and create like an atmosphere of a real conversation. So it's more kind of bringing market research into that kind of social media realm. Is one thing that I would say. The other thing is about communities. I think one thing that I feel like many companies have not yet tapped into is creating Gen Z communities. This is a generation that, because they like to create, because they are very passionate about brands they want to support, they want to be part of the brand process. They want to participate in your product development process. They want to contribute to content. So I think bringing Gen Z into those processes, being product development or campaign creation, and co-creating with them, not only create a group of loyal consumers, but also I believe it's increasing your chances to succeed and with that new product or with that new campaign, because you're getting answers directly from the target audience. And there are some companies who have done really fabulous things in this particular area. I mean, to mention one is H&M has a group of Gen Z community, I think all around the world, even not only in Sweden, that they can tap into for insight and for co-creation and other things they need while considering this particular segment.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like our brands still are like that's the first that I've heard of, like a specifically Gen Z research community? Do you think brands are still like trying to figure out millennials, or are they?
I hope not.
Are they finally moving on? Like it seems like now's the time. Like if you're going to be building a community of for a generational community, like now's the time to be
Yeah,
doing up the
I
Gen
think
Z.
brands need to focus on both, to be perfectly honest, because Gen Z now are at the age that, they are actually starting families now, even if it's delayed. They are buying homes. So, you buy a home, there is everything that comes with it. Yeah. So I think they are certainly a very important consumer. So absolutely you can't ignore it, but I think if you're just making your first step in understanding millennial now, then you are in trouble, but I don't think many people are there. But I think in addition to any effort you do with millennials, it's critical to understand this upcoming generation, Gen Z, because, it's another cohort of 87 million people that's going to matter in the coming years.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, I mean, they are so different. They are not an extension of millennials. They have
Exactly.
had very different experiences. So in your book, you talk about turning insights into a growth engine, which I love. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yes, sure. So I think we reached a point, and as I mentioned before, I've been in consulting for 20 years. When I started my career, it was all about how do you gather all the data. Today, there is no data issue. Nobody is missing data. Everyone has tons of data, and therefore is what do you do with this data? And for me, the only way you can actually translate that data into insight and then into money generating insight or a growth engine is really by asking the right questions. Mm-hmm. And I think if you just generate insight and you can't actually act on it, it's not very valuable. Simply knowing that a group of Gen Z or a certain percentage of millennial are doing something is nice to know. But the question is, so what do I do about that? So how do I translate that into products, into engagements, into communication strategies, etc.? That's how you do it, is asking the right questions.
Yeah, that is so spot on, because you're right. There is so much data that is at our fingertips. And I forget who it was who described it. Somebody on the show described it as like, like casting a wide net and fishing versus like spear fishing, and like actually pinpointing the answers that are going to make the most impact to the business and help make the right decisions.
That's right.
So let's see. This is a layup question for you. Which companies need to focus on Gen Z?
The answer is every company has to focus on Gen Z. And I'm not saying that because I am focused on Gen Z 24 hours a day, but really, I always say what happened with Gen Z doesn't stay with Gen Z. As Gen Z is developing new behaviors and demonstrating new thinking and adopting new tools, those spread to other generations. So, one of the best examples is social media behaviors. We have seen Gen Z going from Instagram to Snapchat and then now to TikTok. And there was a period in time that you went to TikTok and all you've seen is teenagers. And in the last year, we have everyone on TikTok, including grandmas. Yeah. So basically what I'm saying is Gen Z influence is much greater than just their cohort. And if we know that they are becoming the precursor for behaviors for other cohorts, we better get to know them.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And the fact that, I mean, Gen Z is so influential on other generations, which is so interesting. I'm thinking about like some stuff that went viral on social media recently in the last several months about how, you can't do a side part on your hair and you can't wear skinny jeans anymore. And women my age were freaking out. We don't know how to adapt to this. But this, those kind of fashion trends were influencing every generation. and people who are not Gen Z were worried about these things.
I mean, just think about that whole conversation.
Yeah.
It started from a Gen Zer and it just expanded. And so who is driving the conversation?
Right. Absolutely. And so that then it not only influencing other Gen Zs and their purchase decisions. We know they're not buying skinny jeans. We know they're buying something else or whatever. But is that influencing my purchase decisions also as a different generation and others? And I think that brings up another interesting point of like just needing to constantly be uncovering new information about all generations, because those traits don't stay. People continue to evolve and change and have new experiences, or maybe one day Instagram was it and now it's TikTok, and even within the same generations, right? So our behaviors and our values change. I guess like what types of traits and characteristics change and what remains the same?
I think what you describe as, social media and the movement, I think it's shift in attention. Mm-hmm. And I think for Gen Z, the attention keep on shifting. So you have to be, and there is no way to predict that, unfortunately. Correct. I think if anyone could, that would be the Holy Grail, right? And it's just not possible. So I think you just have to keep your finger on the pulse and really follow Gen Z where they are, because they're going to be the next thing. And I think that's why it's very important to marketeers to, just be where they are, even if where they are is not yet so mature. It doesn't yet give you all the measurements tool that you're looking for. It's not yet, not all your competitor brands are already there. Don't wait for that to happen, because by the time all these things happen, they will be going to somewhere else. So you have to take advantage of the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been like one of my favorite conversations. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom on this topic. We'll post a link to Hannah's book, Gen Z 360, in the show notes and in the comments on the post. So make sure you check it out. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to rate and review our show wherever you listen to podcasts. Please remember to vote for us for Market Research Podcast of the Year at the link in the notes. On the next episode, I am joined by Ben Phillips. We will see you then. Bye.